Hello! So I wanted to do a video where I talked about one of these, a katana, and why they're sort of one of the most overrated swords in history. Now, don't get me wrong, I actually quite like this sword. You know, I think for what Japan did at the time with the metallurgy and everything they had, the katanas were kind of really nice. However, compared to lots of European swords, they weren't really very good. But part of the reason for this video is that I'm sure other people have covered things like this. The katana kind of has this mythical rating of one of the best swords ever made, where it's kind of, the Japanese made a very good sword for what they had available, but in terms of all the swords available in the world, it's not a very good sword at all. So let's go over it. So katanas are normally just sub 30-inch blade sort of swords. Closest thing to them really is a European saber. Now, they have this very strange design where there's not really a pommel to them, they just have a very long two-handed handle. So you can obviously grip it with two hands, you know, for all the sort of uses you get out of a two-handed sword. But the issue is you don't have much reach compared to something like a long sword that would be two-handed. Or you can grip it with one hand, probably closer to the guard to give you a bit more, you know, counterweight to the blade, which gives it a nice point of balance. Where is the point of balance on this? Quite far forward, actually. Yeah, probably about there, which compared to a lot of European swords is very far forward, so yeah, you would want to hold it as close to the guard as possible to make advantage of that. Now, let's begin with one of the myths that you hear the most often about the katana, which I think has become a bit of a joke by this point, is folded 1,000 times. So what they mean by that is because the iron quality was not very good in Japan, the sword had to be, like when you were essentially forging a sword, you had to fold the iron or steel and hammer it lots and lots of times to basically get a strong sword. Now it was probably folded a few times to about a dozen times, not 1,000 times. Now the issue with this on the katana's construction is it made the sword very stiff, but that also makes it very brittle. So it means on a strong impact with another sort of hard object, the katana is likely to shatter or, you know, have a nasty bend made in it or something like that, rather than flexing and returning to position. Good European swords are actually able to flex, but again, the problem is the Japanese blacksmiths or swordsmiths were making the best possible sword they could with their resources, so you can't really blame them for that, but for some strange reason the katana now has this like fantastic, you know, mythical sort of sense that you can hit another sword with a katana and that sword will break, while actually it's kind of the opposite, the katana is more likely to break. But handling wise, you know, they handle absolutely fine in that regard, just that it's a very strange point of having a longer handle. Because if you had a polearm, you generally have obviously a completely long handle like with a spear, and then your like actual head at the far end, or there is like a katana variant that's got a really long handle and then a regular katana blade on it. I can't remember the name of them. And, you know, again, they're very odd to wield apparently because you're meant to use it like a sword, but it actually handles like a polearm. So, you know, there's all of that. But one of my biggest complaints of a katana, if you actually thought about using it in combat, and this is certainly a thing I've noticed watching videos of people sparring with it, the actual guard on the katana, is it called something like the Saber, is really small. Really small. Like you can see there that my knuckles stick out from behind it. My fingers are totally exposed as well. All this is going to do is if a blade strikes a katana blade and goes down, yes, that will block it. That's about it. Now, to give you a good example of how this differs from a European sword, let's get out a US 1860 Saber. And when I say European, I'm including America in this because their swords are heavily based on, you know, European designs. So, here is a US 1860 Saber. It's a windlass one. Let's look at the guard. Look, I've got a bit completely covering my sort of hand there. I've got more at the front here, ignore me smashing the ceiling, and a bigger bit here. So if somebody comes to strike at you, you've got a lot more protecting your hand. And there are swords with basket hilts and other kind of handguards that give you way more protection than this one. But the point is that if, you know, you were fighting somebody with a katana and you had this, you know, you've got something here that gives you much more hand protection compared to the katana. Let's just compare the size of these two swords, out of interest. So you can probably see from this that the Saber actually has way more length. Trying to work out where the actual blade itself starts on either of them, but what you can probably see here is if I just do that regardless, the Saber has a lot more reach than the katana, Probably the blade is an extra sort of 5 or 6 inches on this particular saber. The saber's obviously a bit more curved, not massively. Neither of these are particularly good for thrusting. The katana probably does thrust a bit better, to be honest, but you can thrust with a saber, it's just not good at thrusting. But what I was saying again, the point of balance is that the katana actually has a further forward point of balance, weirdly, than the saber, it seems, because the you know, with an actual sword you've got more of a pommel to it than the katana. So it means that with both of these, I know you wouldn't ever be dual wielding them, you know, the saber feels just as manoeuvrable really as the katana if you're using it with one hand. You know, so there is that. So, you know, the point I'm trying to get across with this is that the saber has a better guard and a longer blade. So, and of course, if these swords were to collide, and I'm not going to smack my swords into each other, the obviously the saber would do more damage to the katana because of the better quality steel in it. But that's besides the point, really, because I don't want to keep criticising, you know, like I was saying, the Japanese swordsmiths who made literally the best swords they could with the resources they had available. That's just not fair in my opinion. But it is fair when people actually try and say, oh no, the katana could cut through other swords. Yeah, no it couldn't. But anyway, yeah. So this point I'm trying to bring up is the European or American sabers had much better handguards than the katana had, you know, and they offered more reach and probably a bit more manoeuvrability despite being, you know, similar swords. Now, let's bring up another type of sword with another type of handguard again. So, a military style rapier. You've got a blade on this about 40 inches long, so way longer than the katana on this one. This feels a lot more clumsy to use than the katana. Again, this is actually a John Barnett one, so it's not going to be the highest quality one, but I like it enough for what I need it for. Like I was saying, so this is a bit heavy and cumbersome, but you can see on this one that, of course, the actual guard again gives much better hand protection than the katana. You've got the front of your fingers guarded here, and obviously everything coming down offers a much better guard. So again, this has more reach than a katana, but there's something I want to demonstrate about European sword techniques versus the Japanese ones. This is going to be very difficult in a room like this, but European sword techniques are basically to stand sort of at a right angle to your target, so you can still use footwork and you can go forwards and back using your legs, your core obviously, and your arms, to give you lots of reach advantages and, you know, and things like that. Now, if we go to the katana, as much as I'd be personally very tempted to wield it, sort of, you know, just in one arm like this, as I said, I personally would prefer wielding it like that. The Japanese stances were actually something like this, I believe. Now, again, I am not trained in it, so I'm not qualified to talk about it in this sort of sense, but you'll actually see my argument. That when you were using a sword like this, forward-facing, you actually have less reach, and it's sort of slower in some ways to use. Because although you've got both arms going into it, which, you know, is good, obviously it gives you a bit more strength and control, because European longswords were generally used with two hands, the issue is that you can't stand at a right angle too well if you're using it with two arms. It doesn't really work. You've got a lot more restriction for your shoulders, so you have to stand sort of head on. And the issue with this, of course, is that more of your vital organs are exposed. When you're stood at a right angle to the target, it's much harder for somebody to get at your vitals, and you have more reach. When you're stood like this, it's harder to actually go forwards and recover and everything like this. So if you watch videos of people, especially if they do saber versus katana, which is really interesting, the saber user, if I demonstrate this with both my swords, the saber user can be stood at the right angle, and the saber user can be going back and forth very quickly, you know, constantly doing, and I can't do this because I'm not trained well enough with the saber, but lots of very quick cuts and then, you know, coming back. And the main disadvantage I've noticed, like I was saying about the guards, was that a saber user can literally come in, go to get the katana wield, you know, user's hand. In reality, that would chop their fingers off or completely mangle their hand, and then recover from it very quickly. You know, forwards, swing in, come back, outreaching the katana, and the better guard, meaning that the saber user can be very aggressive in terms of going for it. You know, coming in with all of the attacks and everything else. Whereas the katana, because you're, as I said, stood like this, you've got less reach advantage really, and the saber, because you're basically going to be coming in trying to slash with the katana, but it's not really long enough to slash effectively, so somebody with a longer sword, especially if you're doing Saber versus Katana dueling, is actually in a better position to strike and move forwards and backwards, because they're, you know, at a right angle to you, so they can strike and recover, whereas you're sort of disadvantaged with that. So, again, the Katana's not that brilliant for that kind of thing, just simply because of that. But I don't hate the Katana, don't get me wrong. Now I've actually got one, I actually really like it. However, it's clearly outmatched by a lot of European swords. Now the thing you have to understand with the Katana as well was that Japan used this thing for absolutely ages. You know, feudal Japan going even into the time of Imperial Japan. By the time of World War II, they did actually have proper sort of cavalry sabres and things like that, very European-styled ones, but lots and lots of officers still carried katanas, because it was like a traditional thing to do. And I know, obviously, World War II was not a war that involved sword fighting, but it does go to show how long these things kind of remained in service. And if you've got a sword like this in service, while lots of other nations, I know, you know, Japan didn't actually fight European nations sort of in the sort of Renaissance period or medieval period, you know, anything like that. These swords are clearly outmatched. Now, like with all swords, I think a lot more of them is a status symbol than anything else, so, you know, there's probably a lot more practical pole weapons available and everything else, but this video is more just to counter the really stupid stuff you hear about katanas online, of, you know, it being the most amazing sword ever. Now, there is not one perfect sword design. You know, some swords are better against armour than others, some swords are more manoeuvrable than others, some swords have better reach than others, some swords cleave better than others, some swords thrust better than others. You can't have a package where you roll all those features into one and have them work amazingly. There's always drawbacks. You know, the longer the sword, you know, the more guard you put on it, the heavier it gets. A good advantage being a sword like this. Now I know the higher quality of the sword means that you have a bit less weight on it because it can be manufactured better and everything else, and like I said, I know John Barnett's not an example of a brilliant sword, but the point still stands that, you know, if you have a sword like this John Barnett one compared to the Katana, you know, like a military rapier, the point I'm getting at, it offers you a lot more reach and everything and protection. However, it comes at the disadvantage that it will be heavier than a sword like a Katana. You know, like I said, there's always pros and cons. There is not one sword that cleaves better, has better reach, is, you know, the most manoeuvrable, and is the lightest and everything else. That's just impossible. You can't do it. So what I wanted to come across with on this video, at least, was that, you know, katanas have their place. They're interesting swords. I think they look lovely. You know, they're nice looking swords and everything else. But there's just, compared to other swords, there's just this weird, huge amount of mythology evolved, you know, sort of that's evolved around them, of them having superpowers, which they really don't. You know, it'd be a perfectly functional sword, and somebody who has learnt to fight well with a katana would do well with it. But at the same time, if it had a better handguard, it would be better. That's certainly something. I know this is obviously like, this one's got butterflies on it because they're meant to be, you know, like pretty interesting looking handguard kind of things. But, you know, katanas are not the be-all end-all of swords. You know, I think if you actually had the katana blade and then had a simple European saber kind of hilt on it, it would actually be a better sword. But you know, I like this for what it is, but these are certainly not, you know, the best swords ever made, and they can cut through other swords. And you know, a person skilled with a katana could take on 1,000 men armed with regular swords. No. As I said, each sword has its advantages and disadvantages, and the katana certainly is not the best sword, you know, the pinnacle sword design that was reached. But it is what it is, so there you go.